So, hi, everybody, and welcome to episode 1 of this year's August Acceleration series, which is all about reclaiming our potential and finding all the hidden corners where we might have stashed some of our potential that we haven't even thought about might be there. And I'm just really delighted with the lineup of guests that we've got for you this month, and hugely thrilled to introduce you to Xandra Hawes, who is my very first guest. And Xandra is coming to us from Boulder in Colorado in the US. And she's such an interesting person. And I know that you're going to be wanting more once you hear and you start to hear her experience and what she's got to say, and all the pearls are going to roll off her tongue as she starts speaking. But let me just give you a little background on Xandra before we begin. So she is a licensed therapist, but she's also a psychic medium and a spiritual mentor. And when you put psychotherapy and psychic mediumship and spiritual mentoring all together, you realize that we've got a very rich conversation coming. So she's got an MA in clinical mental health counseling, and she is a licensed professional counselor in Boulder. But she does so many more things because she's also an ordained minister through the Psychic Horizons Center, and she's completed several advanced programs with them, which also involves clairvoyance and trance mediumship and ministry and energy healing. And then she's also done an awful lot of shamanic work as well. With some of you may know Sandra Ingerman, really well-known shamanic practitioner with a wonderful school in the US. And from there, Xandra's even gone into folk herbalism, and she's gone into ancestral healing and wild crafting. So I've barely touched the surface. When you can read her full bio underneath this, but I'm going to say, hi, Xandra. Thank you so much for coming. And I'm going to just get you to introduce yourself in your own words, because I always think it means more to people than when I'm, reading a bio.
Oh, well, you do such a great job of it. And I think it's so funny, right? All the different things that we weave together as we learn and things. So you're right. I've been all over the place trying to look at this intersection a lot of times between psychology, between spirituality, all of it. And it's fascinating.
It is really fascinating because we've called this episode 1 session Emotions, the Bridge to Consciousness, because I think it was something that I learned through my own journey way back in my 20s, that I really needed to feel to heal, and that feeling and healing were so intimately linked that if we can't do one, we don't get to the other. And so much of what happens in healthcare today doesn't involve going anywhere near our emotions, does it? So I'd just love to hear, your perspective on that.
Yeah. Well, what's fascinating on the topic of feeling to healing, it was interesting because I've worked with a lot of different populations in the psychotherapy realm. And one of the first populations that I worked with where this sense of feeling it to heal it became so, so clear was actually when I was working with folks that were more towards end of life, that were working with Alzheimer's, dementia, and I was overseeing, 24/7 care teams where there'd be 12 to 14 people on our team with people all the time. And we started noticing that people that were nearing end of life, all of a sudden there would be these massive emotional releases that would start happening. All of a sudden they would sort of regress into really, really younger states. And a lot of people, when that happens, they start treating older people like children or at lower functioning. But what we saw on a spiritual level was all these things that were stuck in the body, all these different traumas that had happened at 4 years old or 7 years old or 12 years old, before these folks were deciding to pass, the body was actually releasing these things and they were feeling them and going through them. And I started asking, well, why? Why would these things come out now? And what I realized in a way is that sometimes the body waits until we're at a mature enough place to actually deal with big emotional things that maybe we couldn't deal with as children. Maybe as children, we don't have the right support system or the right friend group or things like that. And as these folks were getting older and a lot more wiser and a lot more rest and downtime, to be honest, all of these things started coming through. And so a lot of the work was helping them resource themselves through emotions that actually had been stuck in the body that they had never felt. And they would start detoxing through. And I thought, wow, how wise, before someone decides, to cross the threshold or whatever you believe, to not bring those things and to let the body have that big freedom. So I'm a big fan. That's where that journey started really feeling into around, if we feel things, we can actually heal things. And the more that we're willing to be in our emotional center and not overly feed them, but be with them with courage and with love and this sense of being able to hold ourselves, the more we actually go towards emotional freedom, and the more emotions don't actually get stuck in ourselves. They actually move through the body a lot quicker if we don't get hooked into them, or we're not so afraid of them. Yeah.
It's so true, because we've been built with emotions like, they're a navigation system, aren't they? And yet so many of us, until we learn otherwise, hang on to them, stuff them down, and they end up having such an effect on the physical tissues, because if we don't process them, the body's got to hold on to them. And I guess this is kind of a huge crux of your work, isn't it?
It's huge. I mean, I see folks at all different ages. I work with like psychic kids that have really big sensitivities and things, and they're learning how to regulate everything they see. I work with a lot of empaths and a lot of folks that are actually learning how to re-establish a healthy connection to emotions, because there's been so much blurriness around, I don't want to feel it because it's too much, or if I actually let myself feel emotions, there's this difficult kind of boundary between understanding what's ours and what someone else's is. And I think a lot of people shut down the emotional center because there's this sense of not being able to regulate energy, not being able to be clear around what's ours. And so even 2 days ago, I was coming home from the airport, and I love people. It's like, I love talking to people. I have the most crazy stories of who I get to sit next to on airplanes or in ride shares and lifts. And in the process of trying to get home from the airport, I get into this huge, in the United States, this massive truck. And there's this guy, and there's this Tesla that literally almost kills us like twice. And luckily the driver is very good. And these emotions start getting kicked up for him. And I was like, oh, I wonder how he's going to regulate himself. And I was like, thank you so much for saving us. And we get in this big conversation in astrology about how he's a Cancer sign and he feels everything, but he has a switch that he's developed as a man to turn it on and off so that people don't take advantage of him. And we started talking about how he has this martyr energy where he feels everyone's experiences. And so he gives when he doesn't feel like it in order to save people, because he doesn't trust that people can handle themselves, and that builds resentment. And it's just all of these layers in here around when we don't know how to work with our emotions, when we don't know how to have good boundaries, when we don't know how to trust other people, we sort of shut that really amazing system down that can be such a gift, especially if you're sensitive. A lot of people think of sensitivity as a weakness, but I really think of it as a strength. And like you said, a navigation system. So many stories, even as we're talking, I'm like, oh, there's so many pieces around the feeling to healing it, and people working with it in their own amazing ways. But I always think of the goal is to have more of our freedom, whether it's our spiritual freedom, whether it's our mental freedom, our emotional freedom. The goal is to not be afraid of ourselves or feel like we have to hide parts of ourselves because we're afraid that we might get lost in it. A lot of that has to do with resourcing ourselves differently. Yeah.
That is so true. And before I go there, I just want to draw you back to something you said, because I know that some of our audience might not be familiar with the term empath. And I just wondered if you could sort of explain that a little bit more and how that links into sensitivity.
Yeah, absolutely. So I don't know if this is a real coined thing, but it's what I think of in my head. I call it the spectrum of sensitivity. And so sensitivity a lot has to do with our ability to feel into energies around us, right? And they can be sort of on a spectrum. Some people might be known as an HSP, or a highly sensitive person. It's becoming more of like a clinical word. It's not yet like a full diagnosis, but it's becoming more pop culture psychology around someone who literally the world physically around them feels like it's on steroids. Maybe certain crowds, lights, sounds. Sometimes people that are HSPs can have different thinking patterns or even be on the spectrum, but a lot of people identify as it feels like their nervous system is just hyper aware of a lot of the stimuli around them. And that can be from trauma that's created. And some people are actually just born with that. And then empaths, they can be highly sensitive people. So you can have that part as well. But an empath has to do a lot in feeling other people's literal emotions. If you're the person that, for example, walks into a room, maybe you're going to dinner and you walk into a restaurant and maybe it's not so busy, but you kind of scan the tables as you're waiting for yours. And immediately you're like, ooh, that person's angry over there, right? We can kind of pick up body cues around those things, but empath literally feels the energy in their body. The heart might become heavy. They might start getting sort of anxious because they might notice someone else getting anxious. And so there is literally a way that you sense into the bigger emotional energies. And as we know, emotions literally are energy that are pouring out of our energetic field. So we can pick up on those things at a biochemical level. And some people are just more trained or attuned to those things. So empaths are people that sometimes struggle. There's the empowered empath, which is recognizing those things and being able to separate yourself from it. And then there's the disempowered empath, which is the person that often feels prisoner to those things and often feels very unresourced. And usually those are the folks that shut down and talk about people being too much or needing to isolate, or can go into martyr energy where we sort of don't trust other people because we can feel their energy so strongly that we feel like we have to take care of things for people, or we just don't trust because we can feel their energy that they're not going to be healthy or safe. And again, there can be a lot of attachment style in there in psychology. There can be a lot of rescuer energy from parents and things like that. So there's reasons why in there, but that's probably with examples, the simplified definition there.
That's great. And I think the main take home is that there is a route through for whichever level of sensitivity you are, to be able to learn how to have a filter between you and the rest of the world. Is that so?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of people feel, especially if you grow up in certain family systems where, say you have a parent that's really, really dysregulated. Say you have a parent that's not very in tune with their emotions. Kids feel everything. They're so aware, and they model themselves off of parents, because parents to children are kind of like their first gods, right? They're like, this is my model. This is what we do, right? This is how we get along in life, which can be so helpful in certain ways. And also there can be this deep programming about not being able to work with certain energies based off of what we're taught and what we're seeing, but there's absolutely ways to work with it. And as this episode is about, sometimes in order to actually find courage and strength in emotions, you have to learn your own language of them. Because if you can learn your own language and you stop being scared of your own emotions, other people's emotions and other people become a lot less scary. A lot of being able to deal with other people's emotion is a direct mirror for us being able to deal with our own emotions. So the more work that we can do around really understanding and mapping out how we feel and noticing where avoidant behavior can come in to avoiding those things. And there's so much in our world that's just so excited for us to do that, to avoid and go consume and, do other things. The more we put the work in, the more that we can actually be with other people, the more we actually heal our world, as weird as it sounds. The more we invest in us, the more we invest in our entire society changing and growing and healing. It's pretty profound, actually, at a micro and macro level.
It is. I mean, that's what we found. Everything we do in Alliance for Natural Health is aligned with nature. And we do find that when you start to take more care of yourself and you really get into what that means at every level, then the knock-on effect is you become a better caretaker for the planet as well, and for all of the species and the life forms that's in it, because you just become so conscious.
Yeah.
And I think that's the other point that I really wanted to talk about with what you're saying now, is that emotions and consciousness kind of go hand in hand. And we've just been through a pretty unusual time on the planet in the last few years. It's like if somebody could have just spun the dice and let everything, the chips fall where they may. That's kind of where everyone is at the moment.
Yeah.
But what we're seeing is this huge this huge explosion in consciousness, and people are suddenly looking through. It's almost like they had the veil just moved aside so they could see a little bit clearer. And one of the reasons why we're doing this series this month is because I know that there is so much calling in people now to answer their heart and to listen a little bit deeper. And so I love the fact that so much of your work helps people tap into their inner wisdom and start finding their soul's purpose. And we know from all the work that's been done on the blue zones, Michel Poulain, all the work that was done there, that mission and purpose is the number one, top of the list reason. So when our founder, Rob Verkerk, actually met Michel Poulain, and he said to him, I love it. I mean, I can see what all the sort of 9-10 criteria are, but he said, if you had to pick one that was top of the list, what would you say? And Michel Poulain said, without a doubt, it's mission and purpose. And I think that, that also speaks to our soul's purpose. So could you just weave into this tapestry sort of the concept of consciousness and soul's purpose, and how you help your clients to kind of find their way through with all of that?
I think it's such a good question. And I even draw from that authenticity, because if we can be our full authentic selves, we actually find that mission and purpose actually comes through a lot more clearly. It's when we are not in our full authenticity that depression starts to happen, that anxiety starts to happen. There's what if, there's all of these things when we're not being our authentic selves. And so when we talk about consciousness and what I call soul essence and things of that nature, it comes from, my perspective is sort of grounded a little bit in sort of the Buddhist psychology standpoint. And so it comes in from the perspective that at the core of sort of the Tibetan Buddhism that I sort of studied and that my degree sort of came out of, essentially there's a concept called basic goodness or brilliant sanity. And it's this sort of, it's a little bit more of an image, I think, sometimes than like a tangible, but it essentially says that there is this inherent goodness, there is this light, there is this soul. They don't always use the word soul. There is this energy within us that we are born with that is pure kindness, goodness. It comes from love, it comes from health, it comes from healing. And that as we go through trauma or as we go through difficult experiences, sometimes there are patterns or things that are programmed into us that are not actually us, and they become like clouds. So if we can imagine that goodness or that consciousness or that essence, the sort of Buddhist perspectives is we're born with that energy. And then as we go through life, there are sort of these clouds sometimes that get in the way. And so there can be this longing in people to access that more readily and to feel loved and connected to that ancientness or to that consciousness. And so sort of your question, there seems to be a lot of folks that are doing a lot of work on the clouds around, wow, there is this longing, or there is this deeper knowing in me. There's a mission and a purpose. There's authenticity. There's something deeper in me that's starting to wake up and resonate. And sometimes there's a concept in the US that's gaining a lot of traction, and it's called spiritual materialism or spiritual bypassing. And it's this kind of funny concept that in the process of trying to connect with that, you sort of miss the emotional work. You miss doing sometimes the painful work of peeling away these clouds, because sometimes when we tap into that essence or that consciousness or this deeper wisdom within us, this is the feel to heal place. Sometimes when we are kind of moving into that frequency, the body detoxes out the old emotions, almost like the first story that I told.
Yeah.
So what I see a lot is that people are having these spiritual awakenings, or sometimes there can be traumatic events that happen for people, and it sort of opens them to this greater web that they exist in, that they're curious about, and they can feel kind of through their sensitivity, but it's hard to conceptualize it usually to begin with. But the spiritual materialism and bypassing concepts are basically saying that it's all sunshine and rainbows in the process, and not showing that sometimes in order to let go of the clouds or the old pieces or the programming that was never us, there sometimes are tears, there's sometimes sadness, there's sometimes anger, because those are the locked up emotions that got in there that sort of dulled that connection in the first place. So I do a lot of work with helping people uncover that from a psychotherapy lens, but sometimes especially sensitive, empathic, intuitive people, that light switch is already on, but it has been filled with doubt. There's so much doubt about being able to trust the self. So it's really learning how to work that patterning out of the body and really affirming new belief systems in there as well. A little bit of a long answer, but again, the weaving.
No, I mean, it's beautiful. You weave such, such gorgeous pictures for people to understand. And what I can hear as well is that I just love that you've come through, the psychotherapy side, which is, really serious medical discipline. But then you're also weaving in the softness of the Buddhist tradition. But in what you're saying as well, the ancient wisdom from the shamans is in there as well, because I mean, this is a little bit, isn't it, about, the soul retrieval that they used to do, and the shadow work, and finding the parts of ourselves that we've jettisoned because, too painful, too hard, too difficult, too hard basket. Could you talk a little bit about collecting pieces of ourselves along the journey?
Yeah, I love, and you've probably seen this too, right? In your work, especially with health, there are so many overlaps where in one tradition it's called something else, right? And another tradition, you're like, oh, this is so fascinating. This is sort of the cultural understanding of this here. So I think about how, yes, in Elena, there's so many different types of shamanism, right? But at some of the core of it, it's working when traumatic, painful things happen. I sort of think of some of those traditions kind of view the soul almost like liquid, almost like a glass. Like our soul is just like not one constructed thing. It's more etheric. It's more flowing like water, and you can be in contact with all of it, or you can be in contact with pieces of it. And so, right, some forms of shamanism talk about when painful, traumatic things happen, that it's like part of the soul actually leaves the body and goes to a safer space. Actually, it's saying that soul loss happens, and all of a sudden we can feel like, because of trauma, part of our goodness or part of that trust or inner knowing left, and that energy sometimes of doubt, of pain, of things like that sits in our space. And that's not to say that grief or sadness or all those things don't have a really beautiful part. It's just important to let the body work through those things. And sometimes a lot of people aren't with it in an appropriate way. And so we kind of hold on to it, and it becomes our belief system, and we disconnect from that knowing part of us. Versus if we go over here into psychology, I was reading Xandra Ingerman's soul retrieval book, which I love, and was taught how to bring pieces of people's souls back. And I was sitting there reading the book, and I was like, oh, in some ways, this is like clinically what they call disassociation. This is fascinating.
Yeah.
So this is, right, when a traumatic event happens, it's like we dissociate, right? Or even 2 years ago, I was driving down the road on a big, big highway, and all of a sudden I saw a motorcyclist go down, going like 60 miles an hour and just sliding down the road. And I was like, oh my gosh, okay. And we ended up stopping and connecting with this being, and right, like dissociated, like the soul, the consciousness, we go into shock, right? The body is trying to figure out what's going on. And so sometimes there can be healthy ways of sort of this consciousness or this awareness leaving the body in a way here. And sometimes if we don't come back in, if we don't regulate, it can literally feel like a traumatic event, like part of us left there. And it can be really hard to access that part in therapy as well. So sometimes if someone's really trying to move through and talk through an event that's really painful, sometimes they'll literally go blank, or they'll look at me and pause, and I'm like, is it getting blurry? And they're like, yeah, it's getting blurry. And I'm like, great. So that's the part in that experience where consciousness left. So that energy, you need to bring your conscious awareness in a trauma-informed way back in, help you run energy together, and help you bring this awareness back in so that the body can actually let it go, because that's the part where they left. So there can be these overlaps in different traditions about how, when painful things happen, we as a being, as a soul, as a body, work with it. And there are different ways to bring those things back. Hence the spirituality and the psychic mediumship and soul and a little bit more of that work. Or sometimes it's more through the talk therapy or the somatic therapy or the mindfulness or somatic regulation techniques, things like that.
I think that's the thing, is there's so many routes, but what is amazing is that the way to heal these bodies has been known for such a long time, through all the ancient traditions, through all the indigenous tribes, through the trance work, through everything. And I feel like it's now time for us to not denigrate one over another. We need to realize that each individual has got their own path to healing, and to put it all out like a beautiful buffet, so that people can choose what their calling is, as to what they need to do now and now and now. And so that's why I love talking to you and working with you, because you bring so many of these and you just blend them in so effortlessly. And I guess this translates to your work as well, does it? Do you choose to pull on different parts of your own skill base, depending who's in front of you and what they're needing?
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting because there's more in sort of the bureaucratic parts, right, of
Yes.
the therapy realm. There's such a range of how people work, and what's fascinating to me is that if someone's coming in and saying, hey, I think I want to heal something, a lot of times on the psychotherapy level, psychotherapy sometimes is very past based. It's like, okay, what is stopping you in present time from being your authentic self? Are we looking at certain trauma based things? Are we sort of making a map of what's stopping you from being in the way? And we're going backwards a lot of the time. Sometimes we're doing future, but a lot of the times it's really past based. And a lot of the times psychotherapy is learning how to trust the self. It's learning how to be enough. And those are all based off of past experiences, are mirrors that were never true in the first place for most people. So it's really kind of looking at helping them trust themselves, versus if someone's coming in, say for like I do psychic medium readings for people all over the world. And a lot of times it's like if someone has a very particular question about something, or they want to open those abilities for themselves, I stopped doing as many psychic readings because I was like, I really just want people to access this information themselves, because they can't. But it's doing and clearing out a lot of that work. So I still do some psychic readings for folks, but a lot of the psychic mediumship and the spiritual mentorship is people that feel really resourced in present time. They're like, I actually feel really good on a past level, but I'm really looking forward. This is my vision. This is what I would love to move into. This is what I've been curious about. Maybe they're going through a spiritual awakening where all of a sudden things are coming through their dreams. Sometimes I see people on the spiritual, I call it spiritual emergency. It was coined by a really amazing man called Ed Podville, who was part of the kind of Buddhist psychology place. And he talks about how sometimes it's through losing a particular person that we love that all of a sudden there's this search for meaning and understanding, and all of these sort of spiritual things can come through. All of a sudden animals we start seeing, and it feels like there's something there. Colors, symbols, there's this speak that starts coming through, and people say, wow, something's opening in me, something's coming through that seems really traumatic in a way, but it's more forward. So when someone's coming in, a lot of times I'm looking at, are they needing to trust themselves? And it's very much so based off of a past experience. Or is someone coming in and is really looking to open these abilities up for themselves, and they have a vision, but they feel very resourced and clear, where we're not going into trauma-based psychotherapy. We're sort of going into clairvoyant skill sets, and clairvoyant just means clear seeing. So it just is helping someone see more clearly. A lot of times there's a lot of red tape people think around psychic abilities. I'm like, no. Everyone is psychic. We're all on the psychic sensitivity spectrum. It just depends on how clear you are to receive the information. I guess that's how I see it, at least.
I'd agree, is that we've all got the same gifts, haven't we? It's just the fact that our conditioning and our programming and our life experience can have taken us down different pathways. And I think that personally, I think that it's no coincidence that our entire education system takes us away from ourselves currently. And so the yearning that people have for something that they don't know what it is, that leads into addictions and, negative behavior patterns and, depression and anxiety and deep trauma. So much of it is because the calling of our own inner being, our own soul's wisdom, our journey, it can't get through, the clouds, basically. And so do you also, have a lot of success with helping people move through physical health issues as well? Because so much emotion is linked into what our body's dealing with as well.
I think you're right. There's such a intersection where sometimes I'll see folks, for instance, there's a person that came into my practice years ago and they had been diagnosed over and over and over again with fibromyalgia over and over. And I see that a lot actually with sensitive people. And it was interesting because this person was in the medical field. And so she would get really frustrated because she literally worked in the medical field. She knew all these different tests. She knew all the Western medicine, and yet there was nothing that could be pointed to around doing anything or, anything, all of her panels basically came out clear. They're like, you're healthy, this is in your head, basically. And so working together, and she's very sensitive, very empathic. And we realized that it was so easy for her when she was in a car, for instance, and maybe an ambulance was coming down the road and everyone would have to pull over. She could feel the pain of whatever was going on inside. She could feel the anxiety of the people going past. Sometimes she would cry or tear up because she was so aware of what was happening. She could feel other people on the road. There was this way of being able to feel into those things, but it was in a disempowered way. So it was this way around like, I feel so much. And I've noticed that, at least it seems to be in our world, a lot more people that can tap into pain and sadness than they can into joy and happiness. We can, but we're like so attuned to like notice the pain and the sadness and the anger more, and people sort of match that frequency. So when I work with people that are having physical pains in the body, sometimes diagnostically it's through the fibromyalgias of the world, or it will be like, there's a pain right here, there's a pain right here. And a lot of times we will get people on the team as well around body workers, or we look at health, or there's nutritionists, and we try to get a team of people together to make sure that all pieces are being helped in a way there too. But it is very common for someone to come in and have, especially I see like with women, like pelvic pain and things like that, around birth trauma, around fear of being enough, around, sexual abuse, things of that nature. All of these emotional things, our body's amazing. It's like this massive, amazing backpack that has all of these resources, but sometimes we shove things there in different parts of the body. And a lot of the energy work that I teach has to do with a lot of more chakra-based things and running energy through certain meridians and things like that. And so people sometimes have been able to clear weird pains in things that have been with them their whole lives because they realized it was more emotional. And sometimes I wonder how much pain that we're actually carrying if it sits too long in the body and festers. I think it was Louise Hay who had so much medical intuitive stuff. And when you look up like cancer, her perspective was that it's anger and resentment that's been sitting and seething in the body, and the body has started to like attack itself in different ways. And again, I can't confirm or deny whether that's true, but I always look at how our emotional health, if we hold something in our bodies and we restrict around it, and the muscles and everything starts orbiting around that, it has to impact us. Right? So much about this in the health industry. I'm like, Mel, take a mic.
No, I mean, absolutely. Because our tissues hold memory. And so, these emotions that are meant to be a navigation system, that are meant to be showing us the way and guiding us, we end up grabbing onto and stashing down and not feeling and hanging on to. And I think our bodies have been made to process emotions like we breathe oxygen in and out. And yet the whole of our society, there's all these emotions that are bad, and so they sit in this corner, and you're not meant to feel them or share them or show them. And these emotions are okay, but actually you can only let them out to a certain percentage, because otherwise, you're just too much for people. And so, by the time you get to adulthood and you've come through your childhood and schooling and all the peer pressure, and you're pretty much boxed up. And then depending on what route you go down, you either stay in the box and you find a level of happiness, or you spend decades going through all the shadow work to get out the box so that you can actually then change your life completely. So I think I never did well in the box. And I had a body that was very, very sick. So I spent the first 20 years of my life incredibly ill. And when I was 20 and I was kind of left on the medical scrap heap, and they washed their hands of me, and it's like, well, there's nothing more we can do for you. And I'm like, well, I'm really sick and I have a non-functioning body. What am I going to do? And for me, it was the spiritual door that opened before the physical healing door. And I grabbed it with both hands, because, as I say, the box never fitted me very well. So I was happy to get out of it and go and play in a different box. And so I learned in my 20s the power of emotion and how we've got to let all of this stuff out so that we can start to have a body that functions. But it took me some time, and I'm so committed now to finding people like you and like some of the others I'm going to be talking to this month, and the information that I share, to show people that, for me, it was a 25-year journey. And look, we're never at the destination, are we? But what I mean is that to get a body that kind of works and to be able to live the life that I want to be leading, it took me 25 years. But that learning, you're learning where we've all got to, it doesn't have to be the same for other people, because we can come and we can share all of this, and people can choose what their fast track's going to be. And I'd also, I know that you and I are, I've been doing this a lot longer than you. And so I can say that going back into the 80s and 90s, the shadow work was hard. And you really had to get down dirty with the processing. But have you noticed that we really seem to be able to process incredibly quickly now? There's a different energy and a different consciousness and a different have you noticed that the speed of lightness of being has changed?
It feels like, how do I say this? It has been this massive influx over the past few years of almost like people don't have a choice. And when I say don't have a choice, it's almost like people are coming in and they're saying, I'm not sure what's happening. All of a sudden I'm thinking in a different way. All of a sudden I'm noticing there's this desire for more authenticity. I'm realizing that I don't want to work for a company that doesn't appreciate me. I want to have meaningful. There's this longing, or there's this desire to be more in alignment with our best selves. There's this desire, meaning, purpose, authenticity. We are meaning-making creatures, and our emotions, we love being fed by things that feel good, right? On a primal level. So what I have noticed is that when I started going into psychotherapy and I started working with people, there was a lot of just trying to heal at a certain level. I want to heal my depression. Okay. I don't want to be sad. I don't want to be anxious as much. But I've been finding, and this is where the intersection of the spirituality and the psychology pieces is that people are saying, not only do I want to not have this in my life, but there's something more. there's something better. There's something that will not leave me alone. It's almost like, not in a mean way, but like something sort of poking, or something sort of kind of in people's minds that is saying, I want to live a more authentic, more aligned life. And I didn't know I could ask that for myself. And what I see as tricky is that I feel so grateful for the explosion of coaches and the explosion of people that are like, I want to mentor, I want to help through their experiences. So there's so many people going through and doing the shadow work. And then you have all this criticism of like how people are doing it, or the right ways. And I just try to send love to everyone's process of how they're doing it, as long as it's authentic. But it seems to be, I'm seeing a lot of, and it might just be the people that I see, but there's a lot coming through spiritual awakenings. There's a lot coming through spiritual emergencies. There's a lot I see coming from losing a loved one. I see a lot of people like losing a job. I can't even tell you, my office is about a mile away from CU Boulder. So I see a lot of PhD students, a lot of master's students, and they're going into programs and they're in the middle of them and saying, oh my gosh, this is what my mom wanted me to do. This is what my mom wanted me to do. I am terrified because I've never asked myself what I want to do. But there is this way of struggling with trying to grit, right? And put in the hard work for things, because it seems like a lot of older generations were like, I just need to put in the work. I just have to suck it up. I just have to do what's needed. And there's a lot of judgment from older generations about younger generations being lazy or entitled, which, you know, there could be some in there, like the technology and things. But with this generation, there is something around like, I'm not willing to settle for something that's not meaningful or purposeful. And in my experience, people have been willing to do the work if that's sort of lit up. But there's a lot more folks requiring that meaning and purpose and authenticity and being awake, feeling good, taking care of ourselves. There's so much of I want that now, versus it seems like in older generations, it's this programming of you have to work yourself into the ground and then you eventually retire and then you get to enjoy life. You just got to work for decades. And there's something wise to be said about persevering and really hanging in there and learning so much about your edges and mastering things. But it's different generationally. I'm sort of seeing, and even folks in older generations that I'm seeing that are retired are noticing that and saying, I had this like idea that I would just be in my 60s and I would just get to enjoy. And what I'm finding is that I didn't get to enjoy all that time. And so now I'm doing all the shadow work that got built up during those ages. And now they're doing all the emotional work that they didn't feel like they had time to because of their kiddos, because of their job, because of all these obligations. They didn't feel like there was time or space. So they packed them away. And now that they have space, the body's like, great, let's detox all these things out that you've had to shove in your backpack over this many years for your kiddos. And they're like, oh man, like I wish I would have done some of this before. I just thought it was going to be easier. So I don't know if anyone ever gets away with shoving those things down in the body. When I worked with folks with Alzheimer's and dementia, they certainly didn't. So not in a threatening way. I don't want to throw it out there, but the body keeps the score, right? It holds
the
it.
body, it does. I don't think any of us get away with it. I just think that we're on this amazing freight train of this paradigm shift in consciousness, and it is changing the experience, because before, all those decades ago, it was a small minority of people that were doing it. Now there are so many more, and this desire for a heart-led life, meaning and purpose, being guided, feeling the inner calling. And I'm thrilled by that, because I think that life, this concept of life is struggle. I mean, we so need to change the paradigm on that, because life is meant to be joyful, and we're also meant to be here to experience the positive power of creation. And so if we don't process our emotions, if we don't cross that bridge to our own consciousness, if we can't feel our soul's purpose, then we can't live a joyful life, can we?
I mean, Nike says you're supposed to just do it, right?
Yes.
Because you're just so supposed to buy all the things. I agree with you wholeheartedly, and it's so tricky because I'm curious to see how the soul and being in alignment with the soul, how we can do that on our own without being sold certain things. And that's a whole other topic too. But I don't think you can. I think a lot of our society says and populates, oh, you know, you need to buy this, you need to go do this. But I think we're both big fans of you have everything you need. It's all inside. There's just this amazing capacity to grow, to heal everything if you learn the deep listening, if you learn how to work with the emotional center, if you learn how to not to be afraid. I absolutely think it's possible. It's just I see a lot of people using the coping strategies of going outward, right? Even there was a client a couple of weeks ago, and they made a poor decision around drugs and alcohol. And I said, well, let's look at your tool belt. What were the options instead of, you know, going outside of yourself? And they were like, well, you know, this is a younger client. They're like, well, I play on my phone. And I went, great. Okay. So maybe healthy distraction, Tetris outside on your phone. Okay. What else? They said, well, I usually watch TV or a movie or play a video game. And I'm like, great, outside of yourself, what else? And they're like, well, sometimes I call a friend. And I'm like, great, co-regulation, also a little bit outside of yourself, right? And we sort of went through all the strategies, and some of them were really good, but 100% of them were outside of themselves. And I was like, what's the inner, what's going in? And they were like, oh, I don't go in those circumstances because it feels like an ocean and I'm going to drown in it. And I said, okay, I think that's why you're here. I think this is where we start. I think this is where we start with it, right? So yeah, I think it's totally possible. I think a lot of people just feel really unresourced about what to do with the feelings, how to let go. I get that question all the time. How do I let it go? Because I keep telling myself to let it go, and I know it's important, but it's still in my body. It's still swirling around. And so that's where a lot of the neuroscience or like there's certain things called like ERP, which are like the gold standard for like exposing yourself to the stimulus and deciding not to avoid the behavior and actually letting it get bigger and working with it.
And what does ERP stand for?
ERP is exposure response prevention.
Okay.
So it's almost like if so say someone's really, really anxious, say they have a really difficult time at work and they come home and they're really anxious and they're like, I can't tell like if I should stay here, and their mind starts spiraling. And it's almost like a graph, right? Almost like the line of distress starts going up, and they get to that peak energy where they go, I don't know how to work with this. And so they look around and they go, oh, I would love to have a glass of wine and to watch my favorite show and eat popcorn or something, right? And they sit on the couch and the distress goes down and they get a dopamine hit and the body goes, oh, great, because your thoughts were making me feel like we were dying. So I told you that you should avoid feeling like this and you should do all the things. And again, there's nothing wrong with those things, but a lot of people don't do it with conscious awareness. Before they can even sense what's going on, they reach for those things. And the problem is, so if we can imagine like a triangle, the stress goes up, it goes down, and then they go back to the same thing. The tricky part is that gets locked in sort of this triangle of people not feeling powerful because they go, well, every time I feel this level of anxiety, I don't know what to do. So I do this particular thing. And so people literally go, I don't know how to get through that. I struggle really hard because they don't stay with the distress long enough and resource themselves enough to actually get through the other side. And that's what we need sometimes when we look back and go, oh, I can get through this because I got through that. So there's something important about exposing yourself to the energy and leaning in and telling yourself it's actually really good that you're feeling this and working with the energy of it, rather than leaning backwards. So a lot of it is trying to figure that out. So that's just an example, right, of like how we have everything inside of us, but we're so quick to avoid pain, and we are taught that pain is bad. So that's another part of emotion, is learning that big emotions don't have to be scary or bad. You know, we got floaties in there. You just have to rediscover them.
And so have you got any kind of top tips or anything for, I mean, obviously big stuff, absolutely, you need to go and visit someone and get some help, because there's no point floundering on your own when someone can throw you a life ring. But any top tips for what people can do to just start tuning in a little bit more and feeling a bit more empowered?
It's a good question. I think so if we take the example again of the person that had a hard time at work, right? And they're struggling with, do I stay in my job, right? A lot of times what we need to hear, especially when the body starts becoming dysregulated, is the body is like a microphone. It is constantly listening to our thoughts. And I think, I can't remember what study this was, but they basically did a study around people's thoughts and like what thoughts come out of people's minds. And they concluded, I think it was in the mid 70s, around 70 to 75% of what people think about others and themselves is considered negative. So there is something so huge around when you're experiencing distress. This is where mindfulness comes in, and this is where mindfulness practice comes in. Most of the time, your body is literally responding to the thoughts. If you're saying anxiety just means what if, that's literally, if you dumb anxiety down, it is the disorder of what if. It is future tripping into trying to figure out our control, right? So if we were to give a tip for someone maybe who's working with anxiety, the body and how it's getting worked up is responding to thoughts. It is literally just a microphone listening to what's happening, and it starts this whole process of trying to take care of you and trying to fight or flight or freeze or whatever it is.
Mhm.
So most people that are working with anxiety, the more they can actually see the thoughts and separate from the thoughts and realize, am I in present time right now, or did I just go completely into the future or completely into the past? Because anxiety doesn't exist typically in present time. It only exists into the future of what if this happens. Because in present time, we're usually pretty resourced to deal with something, even if it's hard. So a lot of times it's looking at, where is my energy, and noticing, oh, am I going to the what ifs? Because the more that we can work with the mind, the more that the body can also regulate itself. And again, the example of the person coming home with, the glass of wine or the TV show or the popcorn, or whatever it is, those don't have to be bad things. But a lot of times we just need to be able to calm the nervous system. So I tell a lot of folks, if you are feeling dysregulated or really ungrounded, or there's that kind of flighty energy that people feel like is fear, I always tell people, take both your palms, put one big on the heart, put one big on the gut, and start breathing. But your body needs to hear that you're okay. So if your thoughts have been like, I'm dying, I'm a failure, I'm not going to be enough, I'm going to lose this, your body's reacting to that. It needs to hear, I'm feeling really sad at my job, and that's okay. I'm feeling upset because I want to feel more appreciated at work. I would love to be able to provide more things financially for my kids, and I feel pressured to stay in this job so I can do that. It's okay, I'm doing my best. Our body needs to hear those kind things, our best self. I would call that our inner wisdom or our soul or our brilliant sanity, our basic goodness.
Yeah.
It needs to reconnect into that so that it can regulate, knowing that it's okay, and it doesn't have to respond to our emotions as if they're a threat, because that's what it's doing. It's going into that mode because we're psyching ourselves out with our 70-something% negative thoughts, unfortunately.
I know. And I think, that's been the overwhelming thing that we're all dealing with, is seeing the young people in our world suffering with so much anxiety. Now, I don't recall, I had issues, okay? I was unwell, I had challenges, I was unhappy about things, but I do not recall when I was that age, in my teens and early 20s, that anxiety was what I call was an epidemic like it is now. So many parents are worried about the mental health of their kids because they're so anxious. And what's your feeling on all of that? What's your take on why it's so prevalent now?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. So again, I work with a lot of psychic kids. So again, there's a
Mhm.
lot of energy
Mhm.
there. And what's interesting is it's twofold in a way, because kids can find resources easier. They
Mhm.
are on the TikToks or the Instagrams of the world. And sometimes there are people that have healed themselves and they're providing information around anxiety. And sometimes what it does is people almost staple themselves to the feeling of anxiety, and it actually makes it bigger. So there's something important. I've worked with so many kids sometimes that have been in therapy for years, and it's fascinating because they can talk about the anxiety, they can label it, they can discuss it, but they're not feeling it in their system. So it becomes kind of this cognitive dissonance around, oh, my anxiety. It's almost like a scarlet letter. Oh, my anxiety is like this, my anxiety is like that. And there's parts work or things in psychology where you notice that there are different parts of yourselves and you sort of name them or label them in order to befriend them. But there becomes a point where people say, well, I have anxiety and I'm anxious. And there are different ways to see anxiety. Anxiety could just be seen as like excitement in the body. The body's becoming excited, which takes it a whole other direction, with anxiety being like this monster sort of piece. So what I'm seeing in terms of kids and anxiety is there is this helpful way of being able to name it that is sort of coming in, but it's also tricky because kids are stapling themselves to it and diagnosing themselves with it and saying, oh, I have this. And so it's sort of becoming a label, or it's becoming this way that people staple themselves so much to it that they actually don't even get out of it. And so that's the one thing that I'm starting to see. And the second thing is that cell phones are becoming a emotional regulation tool, and they are for most people.
Yeah.
But there's something huge around every time I notice kids are having more and more fights with parents around cell phones because there is so much desire to be in connection with people and co-regulation, but it's through this really weird interface that actually doesn't connect people in certain ways. It actually makes some people feel worse. So I'm noticing that a lot of kids that are on their cell phones more, to be honest with you, seem to have way more anxiety because there's way more comparison. Most of them have their location settings on. So if they get home after school and they look at the location and two of their friends are hanging out at an ice cream shop, immediately there's they don't like me, they're upset with me, I'm bad, I'm left out. There's almost so much information about other people coming in that I'm noticing these kids literally they are a million different places at once. And so they're not in the body, they're not regulated, they're not going outside as much, they're not interfacing and learning social skills as easily. I think even the age of like any sort of sexual like relational energy between kids has gone up like 2 or 3 years, which maybe as a parent is a good thing, but it's literally kids are afraid of each other. Like they're starting to become afraid of actually talking, social skills, all of it. So there is this preference to text someone or call someone rather than talk to someone. It's this way that our humanness is getting put in a technological way, and it's causing people to not feel connected or safe with other people, especially with teenagers. And so it's a little scary, and I have to do a lot of parent coaching around cell phones because a lot of parents have a lot of guilt around how much freedom it gives them. If they give their kid an iPad or a cell phone, they get time to themselves and they don't have to be on all the time. So there can be a lot of guilt around, well, I don't want them to be on their cell phone all the time. I want them to be doing something else, but I need to be doing this over here. So like there's this crux sometimes that I see with parents with younger generations, is wanting them to not be on their phones, but also parents being so absolutely exhausted about how to parent all the time and be on all the time. And I'd be curious how other generations might, older generations might be disapproving of, like, you chose to be a parent. But it's a little bit of a web around kids and anxiety, and what I see happening. A lot of it's relational anxiety. A ton of it is relational anxiety, social anxiety. I don't know how to express my needs. And unfortunately, going onto the internet, resourcing themselves through it, but people on the internet making anxiety like you staple it to you, like it's a scarlet letter. And so it becomes this, like, my anxiety, like kind of calling me like my precious, like my thing that I'll never get over. I'm like, ooh, okay.
And that's why, this series is all about reclaiming our potential, because unless we become more us, more authentic, more connected, more feeling, able to stand strong in the present moment, we miss out on a massive percentage of our potential, don't we? Because we're such incredibly creative, powerful, empowered beings, and shutting the door on all these things. So 2 days ago, I was with I was having a conversation with a father of a 16-year-old, and she's just finished her GCSEs, which is kind of like the main exam at that age before you go on to A levels, which is over here your entry for university. And I said, "Oh, is she going to get a job now?" And he said, "No, no, no." He said, "Probably not." He said, "Because most of the people I've spoken to won't employ any young people anymore because they don't want to deal with the phone situation." I said, "What do you mean the phone situation?" And he said, "Because they can't get off their phones. And so they can't do a job of work because they're on their phones the whole time." I'm just like, wow, really? Because surely if they're going to have a job, that just means you don't get to have your phone at work. I mean, but it was such an accepting thing that she can't get a job because she's that age and she's on her phone, and no one wants to deal with the phones. But that just says to me, wow, I mean, everything you've just said, there's no connection with other people, there's no feeling, there's no present moment. And what about nature? And what about getting out and being in the outdoors and actually engaging? So it's scary. It's scary.
I think it's important hearing the story that you said, because there's so many overlaps. I haven't heard that before around, like, literally people are not taking younger people because this is becoming not being able to focus at work. And I can see it. I can definitely see it. There's something, I think I was working a couple years ago with a 14-year-old, and the parents were very intense about, like, you don't get Instagram until you're 15 years old, basically. And this kid was tantruming every single day because they would go to school and everyone would be on their phones at lunch, like looking at Instagram, looking, gossip, all these connections. And they felt so disconnected from what was going on, because rather than everyone sitting at a lunch table and talking together, everyone's just texting each other next to each other
I
on
know.
their phones. So not having a phone or not having that means that you are automatically disconnected from the way that your peers are choosing to connect. So whether you like it or not, you are isolated or missing out by not having a phone and not having access to things. And so it becomes this deep longing, right, especially in adolescence, for this individuation from parents, but this co-regulation with your peers. And so it's almost as if people don't have phones. They don't actually feel connected. They don't actually feel appreciated by other people. It's fascinating. And in Boulder, luckily, there's a lot of schools that are more nature-based. There's a lot more that are art-based. There's a lot that say cell phones don't come to school and they're learning these things. But in big public school systems, especially in the US, like, you can't control those things. So you have to have a lot of resources or a lot of privilege to access some of these smaller, very specific learning styles. So it's tricky. It's super, super tricky. And I always wonder about, like, the overlap, right, between technology around, can there be ways that technology really helps people come home to themselves, helps people connect? I think there is, but I think from what's being developed and the intention that's being developed, I don't think a lot of the things or the popular things that kids are going into are necessarily creating the healthiest form of connection. And yes, there is so much. I think was it 2 years ago, maybe 3 years ago, where they finally came out with, like, a technology addiction diagnosis, actually, because they started seeing it in treatment centers that anxiety and depression, all of it stemmed back to technology in the phone, actually. And so it was most kids relying on technology to not feel alone, basically. So there's a heart, there's a compassion there with it. But in terms of people navigating back to that basic goodness, to working with their emotions, we are not setting our kids up to be able to do that, because the phone is becoming more of the parent, unfortunately, in a lot of relationships. And as far as I can tell, the phone, unless you've got a very specific healthy algorithm on Instagram, maybe where people are teaching breathing skills all the time and stuff like that, I don't see very many people learning emotional regulation skills and learning peer connection, heartfelt, skills through the cell phone, unfortunately. Yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, you've laid it on the table. We really need to do more of that. And, parents who are awake to all of this, we have to make it desirable to feel good.
Yeah.
And, that, I mean, that's and I certainly know, and I'm sure you do as well, because we've both been on both sides of the coin. Otherwise, we wouldn't do what we do now.
Mhm.
And I think that you brought up so many amazing points. Emotions are our bridge to consciousness.
Mhm.
Consciousness is the way that we caretake ourselves and our planet and have a healthy society. It's how we feel fulfilled. And it's how we actually maximize our potential and we're empowered to live the lives that we want to lead. But it's one thing as an adult to make those choices. And it's another thing to think we've got to caretake future generations and we need to find ways to be able to enable them to feel good enough to want to hang on to that they keep doing it and
Yeah.
to use their phone as a tool, but not as a relationship connecting tool, with them in the outside world.
I agree wholeheartedly. Agree. It's a really, really important line, and there's a lot of ways to work through it. I think there's a lot of parent groups for these types of things too, or ways to give a phone, but you limit the number of hours and things like that, so that there's some sort of limit. So there are ways to do it. But yeah, it's something that parents have to be aware of, because it seems to be in the long run, a lot of the younger generations, they know a lot. They can point out, oh, I'm doing this or I'm doing that, but they don't know how to emotionally get through it. They don't know how to work through it, and the phones become the big thing. So yeah, the emotions are our bridge to consciousness. They are the way that we feel meaning and purpose and joy and connect back into ourselves. And I guess as technology continues to go on, I hope we can hold a high frequency, like you said, around it being a tool rather than, the platform that everything has to go through. It'd be a little frightening. As a
I,
person who doesn't really love my phone, I can say that, but
I know, as the person who doesn't do really any social media or anything. I don't even have an Instagram account. I mean, does anybody not have an Instagram account? But I don't, genuinely. I keep hoping that with all these things, the pendulum swings over here, and then it's got to go all the way over there before it comes back to somewhere in the middle that's workable. And I'm hoping that that's, the learning that we're all doing at the moment is enabling the pendulum to come back somewhere into the middle.
mm,
Xandra, before I ask you to share how people can reach you or work with you, can I just ask you for any last thoughts on reclaiming your potential and, emotions and soul's purpose and how all that might fit together?
mhm, absolutely. I think probably the main thing I will say, and I love stories, so I'm going to give you like a minute of a
Please.
story, but so much as I see people reclaiming their essence, sort of tapping into consciousness, realizing that this soul purpose exists and working through the emotional pieces. I see so many people as they are moving towards health, that all the old stuff, like I mentioned before, does come through. And a lot of people don't know how to reconcile that in their mind, that if they're doing the work, it should be very, very easy and it should be completely consistent. And what I noticed, and I had a really amazing meeting with a woman last week who has been working on trusting herself, has been working on really being able to see her body how it looks. Most of us have a level of body dysmorphia where we can't actually see how our body looks. There's a hyper focus. And we have been working for a couple years now on her ability to connect with her best self over and over again when negative thoughts come up in all these different areas of her life. And she came into my office last week just in tears. And she said, I don't know what's happening. And I said, okay, paint the picture for me. What's going on? And she said, yesterday, I looked in the mirror and I could actually see myself. And she just started crying. And she said, I could actually see myself. I could see what my body looked like, and I just was flooded, she said, with this sense of joy and love. And I just felt perfect, and not perfect in this compared to anyone else way, but I just felt perfect. I felt enough. She said it was amazing. And she said I did all this crazy stuff, and I got it fixed in my head that every day was going to be like that now. She said today, the day I saw her, she said, I have just watched this huge wave roll through me of anxiety. And she kept saying, my anxiety. And I said, okay, if we can move anxiety into the what if that's behind it, what is it? And she said, it's the fear of not trusting myself. And I said, okay, instead of saying I'm anxious, can we say I'm having the experience where I'm not trusting myself? And so we started going into it, and she said, I said, is it in present time, or is this past energy? Is there anything in your present time that you're not able to trust yourself with? And she said, no, my life's going really well. I said, okay, so you're doing it right. There is a what if I can't trust myself, old energy that is coming through like a wave through your space. And yesterday you had a really high, and today part of that wave is detoxing through. And we like to visualize it like a thorn. Mm-hmm. We visualize that when you're healing yourself and you're pulling out a pattern, you're pulling out a thorn. And as you're doing it right, the scary part is sometimes it looks bigger because you're actually getting to the core of it. So when you're pulling out a pattern, sometimes it gets bigger, you notice it more, it gets more annoying, and that actually means you're doing it right in a way. So sometimes when people are feeling to heal, there is this sense that they don't have to feel the sticky stuff, or that there aren't waves of it coming through. And so we always talk about, if a wave is coming through, if you're doing it right, you're healing and you're having these big moments and you're having some lower lows, that's the celebration. That's like, oh my gosh, we're getting to the root of this, and how to not take it personally, and for it to be like a wave, but making sure that you stay on the beach with it. So if anyone's curious about this work or how to visualize it, there is a way of not being in alignment with your best self or working through the emotions. It's so beautiful. As we both know, there's so much radiance and joy of being. There's so much goodness on the other side. But sometimes there is a detox, and it sometimes isn't consistent. We can have higher days and lower days, but it means that you're getting to the end. So that's what I want to leave folks with that are doing the work and that are curious about the work, that it's a beautiful journey of it. And if there's up and downs, it doesn't mean you're doing it wrong, because people get really stuck there around feeling like they're doing it wrong. If it's just not this transcendent, everything's perfect, you know, there's not the down days or the shadow parts that come through with it.
Absolutely. It's, you know, some days you're the firecracker, and other days you're in the swamp. It's but nature, getting out in nature and breathing in some of those incredible chemicals from the forest, always sets your day alight, doesn't it? So Xandra, how can people find you, work with you? We're going to put blurb underneath all of this and everything, but let us know, because you do work virtually as well, don't you?
I do psychotherapy for folks in the state of Colorado in the United States, but I work with people all over the world doing what I call root medicine. So it's how to run your energy different in the body, and then you can access bigger abilities, but you got to clear out the body system of kind of the old energy first. So I do a lot of teaching or psychic readings for folks all over the world. But the best place that people actually usually find me is, I have a podcast that is mental health, psychology, and spirituality. So it's a free resource, and I think I'm in almost episode 40, I want to say, something like that. So it's a really cool resource for people all over the world to be able to access, and there are different emotional mental health topics, whether it's fear, whether it's freedom, things of that nature. So that's a really easy free resource. But otherwise,
and what's it called? What's it called, and where can people find you?
Yeah, absolutely. It's called Soul Essence Center. So right. Soul Essence Center, and it's on Spotify, Apple, Google Podcasts. It's on my website. It's basically every main streaming platform. So it's really easy to find there. So it's Soul Essence Center. And then my website, where most people go to, is soulessencewellnesscenter.com.
Beautiful. And we will put the links there. I've loved our conversation. Thank you so much, because you've just woven this really beautiful tapestry of all these thoughts, and you brought in all the different cultures of healing, through all the ages as well. And so I'd like to say thank you, and I hope that people take away from this, um, the tools that we hold within us are so empowering. But the starting point is being able to allow yourself to feel, which then allows your entire healing process and everything to be able to take place after that. So, Xandra, thank you so very much, and I'd love you to come back in a little while, and we can carry on and talk more. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Mel. Thank you for the medicine that you're putting out for all your viewers and everything that you all do. And we're on the soul team together, trying to help our earth shift. And hopefully there'll be a lot of people that hear this and know that they're part of the team too. And they'll get to jump in and live in more authenticity too.
Aho.